I don't know who this is to, but I have a word from the Lord to somebody today. Maybe to more than one person. Maybe you're watching on YouTube, but here is the word of the Lord. The devil is called an accuser of the brethren. And the devil will make fun of you for your faith in God. Try to point out your weaknesses, and we all have them, and try to put you down. I've had this happen for 30 years in the military, for 54 years as an ordained minister, and I just really feel that there's probably more than one of you, you're being accused, being put down by other people. And, well, what is the answer when we're being accused by people that the devil is speaking to us, accusing us of being weak and imperfect and everything else? What do? And we just stand up on the inside and say, I'm forgiven. I'm a new creature in Christ. I refuse to accept this condemnation. I think that's really important. I refuse to accept this condemnation. I'm going to follow God. Of course I'm imperfect. But Jesus of Nazareth isn't, and that's what my forgiveness rests in, is Jesus of Nazareth. And so you and I are called to be evangelists, and every time I've talked to people about Jesus, there's always that possibility that somebody's going to say, well, who are you? You haven't lived a perfect life. Well, not one of the 12 apostles lived a perfect life. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't live perfect lives. Moses didn't live a perfect life. And every one of the Christian saints, including people like St. Francis of Assisi and Mother Teresa, and one of my favorite saints, Padre Pio, they were imperfect, but they were following Jesus as very best they could, and they led a lot of people to Jesus. And what I'm saying is, this evangelistic message that Jesus is authorizing you to do in this passage in Matthew, don't let anything or any accusations about the weaknesses in your life keep you from sharing it. So the gospel begins with this reading. Meanwhile, the 11 disciples were on their way to Galilee, headed for the mountain Jesus had set for their reunion. The moment they saw him, they worshipped him. Some, though, held back, not sure about worship, not sure about risking themselves totally. There's always something in every one of us that wants to hold back and not share about Jesus and not share God's love. And we have to fight that thing inside of us. And here, this is the 11 disciples. And some of the 11 disciples, the gospel tells us, held back. They weren't sure about worshiping Jesus. They weren't sure about risking themselves totally. So, and many times, human beings trying to lead other people to God, we make mistakes. And it's just like a friend told me recently, a horse is really a strong animal. If that horse doesn't want to drink water, it's not going to drink water. No matter how much you try to pull that horse to drink water, it's not going to drink. And so we all have a little fear about telling other people about Jesus. For some reason, it just reminds me a lot of, I'm fighting forest fires. I'm the only open Christian and 20 firefighters. I'm the only open firefighter as a Christian. There was no privacy in Forest Service barracks, a lot like Army barracks. And so I would read my Bible at night before I went to sleep. And people would make fun of me. But there was another Christian in the group. I didn't know he was a Christian at the time. And after he saw people making fun of me, he said, I know why you're doing that, Ron. I'm glad you don't swear like everybody else here. I'm glad you're doing what you do and you don't go out and get drunk every weekend. But the other people, they were making fun of me. And later tried to harm me for being a Christian. So, don't hold back. The gospel doesn't say which disciples were holding back, but I wouldn't be surprised if doubting Thomas wasn't one of them. I wouldn't be surprised if other of the disciples were holding, and they were human. If the 11 disciples are afraid to be evangelistic about Jesus, then we're in the same boat. And my hope is that when you and I see Jesus, we'll worship him immediately. We won't hold back. And there's great evangelistic things going on in our small congregation. This canoe trip is one of them. It sounds crazy that a canoe trip would be evangelistic. But when you get in God's creation and you're not high or drunk, God will speak to you. And, many times people go on this canoe trip and they say, this is the first time I've ever camped that I can fully remember it. This is the first time I've ever canoed or been in the mountains and really felt the beauty. It's sort of like earlier in the service I asked you to feel the communion hymn. I wish every one of you and every day of my life I would feel God's presence emotionally. Because that's where the power is feeling God's presence, knowing God is there, and having inner freedom to share about God's love. Another tremendous ministry of this church is Freedom Friday. It reaches clear into Missouri, Nebraska, northeast Kansas. People from Topeka will come up sometimes. And people make fun of people that go to Gamblers Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. They make fun of them. But I'll tell you what, the police officers don't. A friend of mine was stopped recently, and the police officer said, what are you doing? Going over the speed limit like this in Horton. And they said, well, I just left a meeting, a 12-step meeting. And the police officer said, good for you. But a lot of times when you come to God, start going to church, people make fun of you. But what that means is you touched them. They see a difference. They know something's going on. And Jesus wasn't deterred by the fact that some of the apostles were a little hesitant and not totally worshiping him. Jesus didn't let that deter him. He knew that once they started figuring out all the miracles that he's done, all the healings that he's done, all the teachings that he's done, they would remember what he said. So Jesus was undeterred. He went right ahead and gave his charge. And here's what Jesus said. God authorized and commanded me to commission you. Go out and train everyone you meet, far and near, in this way of life. And this relates to last Sunday. Marking them by baptism in the threefold name, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I never in my wildest dreams thought my granddaughter would come up, become a Christian, and want to be baptized. Never in my wildest dreams. I always pray for everybody in my family. I had no idea Katie would come to God. And no idea she'd develop a friendship with Alyssa and help Alyssa come to God. No idea. But what happens when you follow Jesus, no idea things will happen to you. I had no idea my 2 daughters would commit suicide. But you know, the secret is leave that in the past and continue to follow God. Because I couldn't control my 2 daughters. I gave them guidelines. They didn't follow them, and they died. But there's always people like Katie and Valissa. You give them guidelines, and they follow Jesus, and they live. And you know, this evangelization we're talking about here is just not life, it's abundant life. Jesus said, out of your innermost being shall flow rivers of living water. I'm not saying it's easy to be a Christian, because it's not. But you know, baptism is a big step. Baptism is the step Jesus told us to do. But then it's much more than baptism. And Jesus said, then instruct them in the practice of all I have commanded you. I'll be with you as you do this day after day after day, right up to the end of the age. I have known some incredible Christians in my life. I never had the privilege of knowing John Wesley. But I know what John Wesley's like because I've seen people that have become a Christian because of John Wesley. You know, almost all the Pentecostal churches are split off of the original Methodist Church. There was a holiness movement within the Methodist Church, and some of the early Methodists say, well, we're not holy enough, we're not being like John, and so they split off. All your Pentecostal denominations are split off that. John Wesley changed world history. There was a terrible thing that happened in France. The king and queens of French, several generations of kings and queens, really didn't help their people. And over a period of time, there was 100-year, there were the religious wars in France, and people got disenfranchised from Jesus, and they stopped following Jesus. And so there wasn't much spirituality in France. And when there's not much spirituality, terrible thing happened. They beheaded the king and queen of France, and they had terrible turmoil, terrible revolution, wars, everything. It was an absolute mess. The French Revolution was a mess. I took a class on the French Revolution in the Graduate School of History at Sacramento State University. France became atheist. Our professor there, this is a state university, Sacramento State Graduate School of History. Every lecture would make jokes about Jesus of Nazareth. Every single lecture for an entire semester. And they were funny jokes. They were hilarious. But they were anti-Christian jokes, anti-Jesus jokes. Because he had totally bought into the atheism of the French Revolution. Only like 3% of people in France go to church on Sunday. It's a tiny, tiny portion. Just the opposite happened in England. John Wesley was an Episcopal priest, an Anglican, they call it, Anglican priest. In this country, they call them Episcopalians. And he came to the United States as a missionary. And he didn't do a very good job down in Georgia. And so he went back to England. He was just a young Anglican priest. And he watched these Mennonite Christians on the sailing ship in a terrible storm. He watched them have peace and serenity. And so he said, well, what's different about your faith in Jesus and mine? See, John Wesley was religious, but he wasn't spiritual. He says, how do you have peace in the middle of the storm that almost sank our sailing ship? And they told him the spiritual peace of Jesus, not the academic, not the religious, but the spiritual peace. And John Wesley said, I felt my heart strangely warmed. John Wesley went on to all the poor people in England, the ones that the Anglican Church was neglecting, the poor people in the inner city of London and in the Liverpool and the big towns. He went to the coal miners, the roughest people in England. Tremendous amount of alcoholism in the coal mines, in the inner city. They had just discovered gin. They just discovered how to make gin, and they made it real cheaply. And so there's a saying in England, drunk for 1 pence, dead drunk for 2 pence. So for 1 penny you could get drunk, and for 2 pennies you could get dead drunk. And there was a lot of dead drunk people in England. What happens when you become a Christian? You quit drinking gin, if you're British. You want to learn to read so you can read the Bible. You get stable. You don't lose your job anymore because you're drunk on the job. Many historians believe that John Wesley and his brother Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, they were all together, saved England from a bloody revolution. The reason there's a king and queen in England today, John Wesley absolutely revolutionized the spiritual life of England, and he also of the United States. He revolutionized the Methodists when they first came. 3 of my uncles were Methodist circuit riders. They get on horses and go to all these small churches in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. And one human being named John Wesley changed the course of British history and of American history. And most people, most Methodists, don't really know that story that I'm telling you. But, you know, my prayer is that you will see God so much, even though you're Christians now, that you feel your heart strangely warmed, and you'll automatically go on day after day after day, right to the end of the age, telling people about Jesus. The first seminar I went to was a Methodist seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky, called Asbury Theological Seminary. Asbury was the first Methodist bishop in the United States after John Wesley evangelized this country, and all his followers did. And we had a student there, an older student, and he had a vision for evangelism. And so Wilmore, Kentucky is about 16 miles from Lexington, Kentucky, where the University of Kentucky is. And he would go and sit in the student union, the student cafeteria, and pray that God would send him people almost every time this student from Asbury went and sat in the University of Kentucky cafeteria or lounge, wherever it was, students would come up to him. He'd begin a conversation with them. And he'd come back to Asbury and he'd tell us, you won't believe what happened today. This person talked with me for an hour in the cafeteria and accepted Jesus Christ. Week after week, when he could, in his schedule, he would go sit. And these were just normal University of Kentucky students, but they didn't have a spiritual connection to God through Jesus, and he'd lead him to God. And that guy became my hero. And let me encourage you, just wherever you are, ask God to guide people to you. It's absolutely amazing. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. So these people that make fun of you, we're going to church, you're a goody two-shoes. Have you ever heard that? You're a goody two-shoes. You won't go out and do this with us. You won't go out and do that. Your life must really be boring. I have people tell me that. Your life must really be boring. You don't ever have any fun. There's no more fun at all. You can't get any more fun than watching people like Valissa and Katie come to know Jesus Christ. And that's the kind of fun I wish for every single one of you. That you won't listen to these people say, you're boring, you don't have any fun. You say, no. You don't understand the fun I'm having. The joy beyond joy, the happiness beyond happiness. And that's what I wish for you as you follow Jesus. That God will just continue to guide you, that you'll have peace that passes understanding,